Hello, hello. You are in for a treat on tonight. We have a scholar, a genius. We have a prolific young man from St. Louis University. Now, this young man is awesome. He is a man that has prepared himself for this hour. Now, so many people say, well, you know what? I want this to happen in my life and I want that to happen in my life, but you got to prepare yourself. This is a gentleman that has gone the extra mile. And he didn't just go the extra mile so he could sit around at a cocktail party and brag about himself. But he has gone the extra mile so he can tell the world about systems that has continued to keep communities marginalized, okay? That he can tell us the information that we need to hear to understand how we can improve our personal lives, how we can improve our communities, and how we can improve our our businesses. We have with us today the one and only Dr. Keon Gilbert. He is an associate professor at St. Louis University, College for Public Health and Social Justice. Dr. Gilbert uses his interdisciplinary training to engage in research and several areas of social capital, health disparities, and we definitely want to talk about health disparities because we know that because of COVID-19, there are African American communities and communities of color are experiencing so many problems. So what we want to understand today is we want to get your insight on some things. Dr. Gilbert is an expert in African American men's health and intervention to prevent chronic diseases. His research seeks to develop diverse partnerships to build community capacity, to sustain health initiatives, and to understand the effects of racism, individual and at the community levels, and various systems that reinforce racist ideologies. Now, this is just my opinion. I feel that the entire government system that we just left from with this past administration, it enforced racist ideologies. Not everybody, but a lot of them, okay? And then he also is trained to help people understand the cultural relevance to health promotions and disease prevention. And four, to promote the development and enhancement of social networks to improve health behaviors. Dr. Gilbert's work draws his training to investigate the intersection of racial identity, racial socialization, and structural racism as an important yet unexplored social determinant of African American males' health across the life course. Now, I'm going to read more of that as we go on, but I want to welcome you to Legal Views with attorney Sheila R. Stuart. We are located at Beamiston Tower, 231 South Beamiston, Clayton, Missouri, 63105. Thank you so much. It is a joy. It is a delight to have someone of your talent with us on this evening. And I would just like to get started with, we use this term systemic racism all the time. You hear people say, oh, it's racist, it's systemic racism. Can you, as a scholar, tell us exactly what is systemic racism?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me and extending the invitation to our institute at St. Louis University to, be a part of the show this evening. So I want to first, thank you and to acknowledge all of your listeners for tuning in. So when we think about systemic racism and what it means, is it's really a way of how we can discuss and describe the systemic nature, the long-lasting nature of racism, and the idea that there are structures in place that seek to advantage some groups and disadvantage other groups, largely on the basis of what we know as the social construction of race. And as a result of that, racism starts to operate at systems levels, at institutional levels, at intrapersonal levels. And so when we think about even examples of implicit bias, the ways that we treat one another on a day-to-day basis because of race, racial differences, as well as even internalized racism. And so when we think about racism operating at those 4 different levels, it's really important in terms of being able to identify the source of the racism and also thinking about what are the appropriate remedies at those particular levels to address it.
Okay, so how would you describe the difference between structural racism and systemic racism?
So structural and systemic often get linked pretty much together. And so it's really the idea that that it occurs within systems and across systems. So how I would differentiate systems in structural racism is actually by thinking about institutional level forms of racism. So when we think about what happens, for example, within an education setting or within a healthcare setting, we can attribute the acts of racism or discrimination based on race because of policies and procedures and norms that occur within either one specific institution or one system, such as education or healthcare. What happens at a structural or systemic level, at a higher level, is really the idea that these examples of discrimination are occurring across different institutions. And sort of the aggregate or the aggregation of those forms of discrimination becomes systemic in nature.
And so for example, how would that affect a person that's working at if a person says, I work at company B, mm-hmm. and they say that I'm experiencing racism, and would it come from the HR and then move up to management and then move up to the CEO? So is it at different levels and divisions when you say structural?
So even within an organization or within a company, we can identify the sources of discrimination. So there could be something happening, as you mentioned, in the HR department. There could be something happening in payroll. There could be something happening in your own individual, department, maybe as a result of some forms of discrimination or bias because of your particular manager. And so what happens if those examples or those forms of discrimination are not addressed at that level, or they are occurring at so many different levels or in so many different departments within an organization or a corporation, that you're unable to sort of break the forms of discrimination or to always address them, even when they're happening within your department. And so it can become systemic within an institution because of the failure of norms, policies, and procedures to actually be in place to address the different forms of discrimination that people may experience. And so part of identifying what happens even in your interpersonal interactions with someone, whether it's your manager or whoever it might be, you have to be able to, one, identify it, and also to have systems and structures within that institution in place to actually address those forms of discrimination.
Okay, because one of the things that I see in employment is that as an employment attorney, you have the managers or the supervisors saying that it did not happen and that, there's no problem here, there's no racism here. And so the employee goes to HR and cannot get relief. They go to their manager and they cannot get relief. And then the story is the same from each department to the next department, that there's no problem here. What are you talking about? And when you bring these parties to the table, their response is, well, we have policies that say that we don't practice that type of behavior. But how do you get people within institutions to realize that this is going on and that the employee cannot get relief when they go from department to department, and it's the same mindset regardless to which department they go to. How do we assist individuals like this?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it happens across institutions, and it happens in other places in lots of different ways. And so part of this is thinking about when we don't document, when we don't account for these examples, we allow these incidents to go invisible. And without proper documentation, and sometimes that's a failure of policies and procedures as well, that there is no very clear way of how do we document these forms of discrimination. And so you as an attorney also understand that you have to develop a base of evidence, an evidence base to show patterns of discrimination. Unfortunately, because we don't document these things very well, these incidents go left unaddressed until there is something major that occurs, and whether there's a lawsuit or something like that, or even what we've seen, as the result of people videotaping a lot of the incidents of police violence, people didn't really believe that it was happening. The police violence has been going on for a very long time. Killings of black people have been going on for quite a while. Now we have very clear evidence because people are documenting these things from using their camera phones. The same thing happens within an organization, within a company, that these things are not documented very well, and people can say, well, there's no pattern of discrimination. There's no pattern of differential treatment that's going on in either this department or another department or across departments. So part of that is, one, acknowledging that it happens, two, documenting them, and then coming up with very clear strategies and plans to address those forms, and to also have in place, when those violations occur, that there is enforcement as well.
Wow. Okay, that's good. Now, what advice, because you deal with a lot of public health, we have this vaccination taking place, and a lot of the communities of color, they're not getting the vaccine. And then it's this real rich community in Florida that's like on an island. I can't think of the name of it right now, but a lot of the wealthy individuals live here on this little island in Florida, and they're getting the vaccine. But then you have poor people that are frontline workers who have to go into these places every day and can't work from home, but they're not able to receive the vaccine. What can institutions like yours, or what kind of support systems can we put in place to help these types of communities that are on the front line of risking their life, but they're not able to get the vaccine or the public health that they need?
Yeah, so we've been noticing, as you mentioned, a number of different incidents where vaccine centers or vaccination centers have been placed in low-income communities of color, because there's been a very clear recognition that a lot of those communities did not get resources in terms of testing. A lot of those individuals are working in frontline, essential worker types of occupations, and they should be a high priority in terms of being vaccinated. And what's happened is a lot of folks in those communities are unable to access vaccine appointments because a lot of them are being driven by online only registration application systems. A lot of people may not have transportation to reach those centers. A lot of those people that live in those neighborhoods may be low resource, they're elderly. And so there are a number of different challenges that are preventing them from actually accessing it. As a result of their inability to access those appointments, people in more affluent communities, white communities, are now kind of swooping in and taking those appointments. And so my colleague Rayshawn Ray and I, we actually just recently wrote about this, and we refer to this as vaccine gerrymandering and vaccine redlining, as a way of being able to describe the idea that there's essentially sort of a takeover of vaccine appointments in low income and communities of color. Also, as you talked about, that there have been a number of examples of people gaming the system in other kinds of ways. And I think one of the incidents you were talking about in Florida, where there was this wealthy community that paid a director of a nursing home or an assisted living facility to get vaccines for that wealthier community. And that's just wrong. And I haven't heard, what the consequences were for that person. I'm hoping that person lost their job, but there is not an adequate replacement then for that number of vaccines that went to that wealthy community that should have gone to the residents of that nursing home or that assisted living facility. So where are the consequences even beyond that person losing their job? And there've even been some examples elsewhere. There was a really wealthy person in Canada that flew to an indigenous community in Canada and took advantage of that system. And so the problem is once you get that first vaccine, you can't sort of fall out of line because they want you to complete the cycle. They want you to get the second vaccine. So you kind of placed yourself in a position of saying, well, I'm going to ask for forgiveness instead of asking for permission. And so we're going to see that happen unless we have very clear data about who is registering, what are their predisposing factors or the risk factors that characterize them and allow them to get a vaccine in this current phase, and also continue to sort of just monitor who's actually getting the vaccines. And so that's also been a very clear problem, that we're not documenting who's registering and who's actually getting the vaccines. In some places we have a little bit of data, but it's not very clear across the country.
Very good, because that's a concern that I have when I watch the news or when I read and do research. I am seeing that communities of color, they are lagging behind and they're not getting the assistance that they need. And it's just a terrible situation, as well as the fact that African-American people, brown people are more likely to have complications and die from COVID-19. So it would appear that if this is a health crisis on top of the other crisis that we are having, that they would provide support and resources for these communities and so forth. Do you know of any resources that individuals can tap into to get assistance for this type of help or medical support?
Yeah, so some of the best things that could happen are where there are vaccination centers, they should prioritize people in those communities because of their zip code. So we know lots of the zip codes where Black, brown, low income, low resource people live. Not only should we place vaccination centers or opportunities in those communities, but we should make sure that those folks that live in those communities have sort of first priority to get it. It becomes challenging in some ways because you can't necessarily stratify or skip people in lines because of their race, but you can because of other types of factors. We also know that in those communities, there are high rates of chronic diseases. They tend to be people with, lower incomes. There tend to be people, again, who are working in these essential worker types of roles, as well as elderly. And so those become reasons as to why you can prioritize them. What some places have been able to do in terms of registering some of those people first before they open up the registration forms to other folks that don't live in those communities, or there's ways that you can structure appointments that sort of maybe even provides a mix of people within those communities with those particular zip codes and folks that are coming from other areas from different zip codes. Another way that we really need to probably get people registered for these appointments is actually relying on younger folks. So if you've got a niece, a nephew, a grandchild, a great nephew, great niece, have them help you register either by phone or, using the online portals. My mom is very tech savvy, but, she's called and, I have some aunts that have called and they've directed them to online portals. And so thankfully they have access the internet and able to access some of those things. But, a lot of people are finding themselves in long wait lines on the phone, and then again, being redirected to online portals. And so we really need to call upon some of the folks that have access to the internet and high quality broadband access to help some of these older folks register. Also, we do really need to just register people by phone. And so the problem across the country is that every state has chosen a different strategy. And even within states, counties have chosen different strategies. And even within counties, the municipalities have chosen different strategies. We live in a very kind of interesting place because we have both a county government and a city government, and they have very different strategies. They've also been given different amounts of each vaccine at different times. And so I think the first initial drop off to St. Louis City was about 3,900 vaccines.
Wow.
3,900. So St. Louis City itself is about 350,000 people-ish, 350,000 people. And they were only initially given about 3,900 vaccines. And so that's, when we see these types of disparities, you have to wonder, well, what is happening? Who's making these decisions? And what new decisions need to be made to ensure that there is equity in vaccinations?
Missouri actually ranks like 47th in distribution of vaccines. We're like the worst state in the union in terms of getting people vaccinated. So that's bad. And we have a lot of vulnerable communities in St. Louis. So I'm treating you today as an expert, okay? Now, I know you don't have all of the answers. No one has all of the answers, but you have really done some great work. Your life work can really assist people in understanding what is taking place today. So the next thing I would like to dive into, and for those that are just coming on, we have with us today Dr. Keon Gilbert. He is an expert, okay, when it comes to all types of issues with health, public health, structural racism, systemic racism, institutional problems that have impact marginalized communities for centuries. So he has studied and he has given himself to knowledge, and he is here with us today to assist us in understanding what is taking place in our nation. Now, Dr. Gilbert, as you know, Biden signed new legislation, okay? Everyone's excited about it. But a lot of people may not know what it is or what it can or what it's supposed to do. So let's kind of walk step by step through this new legislature that has taken place. As we know, former President Trump, he created some executive orders that did away with diversity and inclusion training. And diversity and inclusion training as it relates to all types of facets within the federal government. So Biden comes in on his second day, he takes his pen and he reinstitutes a lot of new laws to help marginalized communities. Okay, so one of his executive orders was to advance racial equity, to advance racial equity and to root out systemic racism in housing and criminal justice. Okay, so can you explain in layman's terms what that actually means and how that can benefit individuals today?
Yeah, so, what you mentioned at the beginning is the idea of reversing some of the policies that the Trump administration put in terms of, so there are a couple of things happen. One, in housing itself, they banned the study and examination, monitoring, and evaluation of discriminatory housing, any research or anything like that on housing discrimination. That happened very early in the Trump administration. What happened over the last couple of years of the Trump administration in terms of banning training around affirmative action, critical race theory, any types of things that dealt with implicit bias, the Trump administration banned them. And as you mentioned, the Biden administration has helped to restore them. So what that means is that there are now, or what can happen is that there will be very clear processes, or hopefully more clear processes in terms of documenting issues of inequity, disparities in terms of treatment, and or examples of unfairness in treatment of employees within the federal government. Also, that provides resources to study areas of not only housing discrimination, but where else other discriminatory practices may be taking place. And so that's just within the federal government itself, which is great. What also is part of that is an understanding that we need to take racial equity or ideas of equity and fairness into account in other places. And so one of the byproducts of what the Trump administration did is that it also, when he banned those types of trainings, that also kind of carried over into people that may have been receiving federal grants. And so now this also releases them from having to stop those types of trainings and other kinds of things to address issues of inequity and issues where fairness was not taking place. And so what the Biden-Harris administration has done is to restore some of those practices to ensure that equity can take place. And so one of the things about equity is that it is not equality. So equality is where everyone gets the same thing. Equity suggests or tells us that if everyone gets the same thing, there's still a number of communities, a number of groups, a number of neighborhoods that still has a gap. There's still something lagging for them. Equity tells us, or the ideas of equity tells us, that there has to be measures and resources in place to fill that gap. So if I gave everyone $100, yes, everyone got $100, but $100 will not have the same effect on one community or one family versus another. And so some families may actually need $175 to actually sort of meet some of their needs. And that's really what equity tries to do. And we have to do a much better job in not only in the federal government, but local and even county governments to truly understand what equity means.
Okay. What do you think equity will look like in the criminal justice system?
Great question. And so, as we continue to have conversations about prison reform, criminal justice reform, some of that really does go to looking at the types of sentencing that's happening. And some of that is looking at the evidence of what are Black and brown people getting for similar crimes as white criminals or even Latino criminals. So we need to be able to look at that data across race, ethnicity, gender, and even place. We also need to look at the impact of certain types of laws and policies. So one of the things that I've looked at a little bit over the last few years was even the idea of child support. So child support is of course really important. We want people to take care of their children, even if they're not living with them. But we've come to know and recognize that there have been a number of racial inequities as a result of child support. So if you have a great lawyer, you can usually negotiate your child support payments down. But if you happen to get arrested for child support, there's still a number of states where that is considered to be a felony offense. Now, what we've also learned as a result of studying child support payments is one, a lot of the money that fathers owe, when the state collects that money, it actually does not go back to the child. It goes to the state. And so that's a problem. And so those are the kinds of things that we need to think about in terms of changing. Yes, we want people to take care of families and things like that, right? But we also need to make sure that the policies are in place are not further disadvantaging. So if you give a father a felony charge and he's released from prison, that makes it very hard for him to get a license in some places. That makes it very hard for him to get a job in some places. And so if we then sort of start to think about policies that have been changing across the country, like ban the box, that helps people to get around, either misdemeanor and or felony charges and having to disclose them on applications. But there has to be other types of policies and procedures in place within the corporate community to help, mitigate some of the damage done by the criminal justice community. So again, this is another good example of how systems need to work together. So if we're going to talk about equity and fairness, we not only need to change the laws themselves so that they are not negatively disadvantaging some groups over others, but we also need to talk about policies and procedures in other areas to make sure that those same examples of disadvantage don't continue elsewhere.
Excellent. And I have a question. What about equity in education? Because, for example, African American women, when they leave college, medical school, law school, we have more student loans than any other group, African American women. Also, there's a problem with high schools closing in St. Louis City, and that children that live in, I guess you would call it a disadvantaged neighborhood, that those schools are likely to close, and kids that live in the disadvantaged neighborhoods, they're more likely to attend a Title I school, which is a school that receives federal funds because the community is so poor. So how do we create equity in education at this point?
It's a great question, and a very complicated question, and even more complicated when you take a place like St. Louis City and St. Louis County into effect. One of the things I learned when I moved here 10 years ago is that people might ask you where you went to high school. And so I quickly learned that was a marker of your social class and social standing, and even a little bit about where you might have grown up.
Right.
I don't get asked that question a lot because I don't think I have a strong enough St. Louis accent, so people don't ask me, which is fine.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Indianapolis, in Indiana.
Okay.
So I tell people, if they do ask me where high school, they have no idea where it is, and I'm like, yeah, it's because it's 2 states away. So of course I know where it is. But education is so complicated because we've never fixed the separate but equal, challenge, right? We never actually did what Brown versus Board of Education, at least on its face, tried to do. All we essentially did was sort of shuffle kids around into different schools, and we never actually fully equipped them to address many of the needs that exist. And so we have still sort of very disparate funding of schools within districts, across districts. And so that's a major challenge that has to be addressed. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to also link that to other types of policies in a municipality or within a county that, if you're handing out a bunch of tax abatements for housing and for businesses, you're actually over time reducing the tax base of that community. And so that certainly means that you have less funding for schools, and that means that those schools become under-resourced and underdeveloped over time. The other things that you mentioned in terms of thinking about, the closure of schools and those kinds of things really speaks to how we value or what we value about education. And the reality that we have yet to fix, and we know how to fix these things. That's the problem. We know how to fix education, and we know how to make sure that schools are well-resourced to equip schools. Perfect examples are, look at the private schools. Private schools charge enough money so that the youth that attend those schools have everything that they need. But of course, there are incredible barriers to lower income Black and brown kids from attending those schools because they're super expensive to attend. If we took some of those models of how to, resource and equip a school or a school district or school system, then we would not have these same types of educational inequities that we have here. When you look at other countries and the ways that they think about education and fund education, not only is pre-K free, elementary school, high school, but a lot of places also provide a number of resources for kids to go to college. We don't do that. We try to, funnel it through Pell Grants, and we encourage people to incur lots of student loan debt. There's been a couple of recent articles in several newspapers talking about canceling, large chunks of student loan debt. And so, we basically have this really sort of long pipeline of developing inequity and encouraging education. And the challenge with that is we've not fixed it. And then when kids get out of school, whether it's high school or college, they're in huge amounts of debt.
Right.
And we've also learned that education does not always have the same benefits for Black and brown kids as it does for white kids in terms of, increasing wealth and social mobility.
That's huge, because it doesn't, because of an African-American male or African-American female, they don't normally graduate from college with the same financial opportunities as their counterpart. They just don't. And the ones that do, that's kind of like in the top, 3%, but most leave college with so much debt, and then they never make the income to catch up with the debt that they owe. And that is a huge injustice on equity.
Yeah.
Equity.
I mean, even President Obama and Michelle Obama, they were unable to get rid of all of their student loan debt until President Obama, wrote his first book, and I think even his second book.
Right.
They were able to finally pay off their own student loan debt as a result of him writing 2 books. And so, and those were 2 people, who had, good incomes at the time before even he went into the Senate, became president. And so it's interesting to even hear their story about them trying to deal with their own student loan debt and, what they had to do to be able to pay it. And so imagine, everyday people trying to address that, and then also still trying to take care of their family, thinking about buying a house, all those kinds of things.
Yeah. What would you say to young people today? I don't know. I see Dr. Lynn Friend is on with us, and she's also a scholar in education. So I would like to know, what can we do to get young people back on track to get their education again? We have lost, when I was growing up in St. Louis years ago, right, that there were numerous high schools. Okay, you had Sumner, you had Beaumont, and then in the county, you had all of your county schools. So you had all of these people in school, high schools and so forth. But now in the city of St. Louis, you do not have these schools, and you don't have young people going to college or excited about going to the university. I graduated, I'm going to Mizzou. How do we get kids re-engaged, especially during this pandemic, when online learning is so complicated for so many kids? How do we get our kids engaged back in the educational process to get higher level degrees?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. So one of the things that I looked at and started studying before I came to St. Louis, I was living in North Carolina. I was doing a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And I started working with a group of middle school and high school Black boys and talking to them about issues related to education and health. One of the things that became very clear to me about education, or their thoughts about education, is that, yes, they were safe places. They understood the benefit of education. They often felt unwanted. They often felt that there were things that were pushing them out of education and, raising their risk for dropping out of school. So some of those things were happening to them. But also what I learned is that some of those things happened to their parents. And so it started to sort of build this narrative that schools are not safe places for Black kids. Schools are not safe places for poor kids. Now, that doesn't mean there are not stellar examples of schools that are really caring, really nurturing, and there's a sense of fairness and equity within those institutions. I'm not saying that at all, but sort of at a higher level, we've not fixed education enough where people feel safe, that people feel that it's a place that's going to prepare them for a future, whatever that future looks like. And so part of that is we really need to reinvest in education in a way that helps, for lack of a better way of saying it, hopefully is mostly adults, that makes education seem sexy. And in the sense of understanding that there are benefits. And so what that also means on the back end is that there has to be some benefits to getting more education. So part of that is fixing some of the issues in education. Some of that goes to teacher prep as well. So when we look at education programs that are preparing future leaders, we have to make sure that those programs are not introducing bias, that they understand some of the unique challenges some of the youth may experience. I've started to work with a local organization, and that's one of the things that they talked about is that some of the teachers that they've encountered through the youth that they work with, those teachers have not been adequately prepared to deal with connecting on a very sort of personal and social level with the students that they work with on a day-to-day basis. They're taught how to teach. They're not necessarily taught how to build positive relationships with those youth. And so that's something that also needs to happen. In addition to some of the things I mentioned earlier in terms of providing resources for schools to adequately, address the unique challenges of students today. Now, I'll make another quick point. Working at a university, we are having lots of conversations that started a couple of years ago about what's going to happen in the next few years with higher education. There are going to be a number of colleges and universities that will cease to exist. One is really related to, the number of kids eligible to go to college is going to drastically decline over the next, several years. That means that there will be, more competition for less humans to attend college across these universities. And universities have to find a way to survive. So part of that means that the universities themselves have to change their models to be able to attract more students or different types of students. And so we've got a lot that has to change within higher education as well to address the same types of needs that, that has to happen elsewhere in education. And so also a lot of kids are deciding to go to community colleges before they go to four-year institutions. And so there has to be very clear partnerships between community colleges or two-year colleges and four-year institutions, pipelines, because a lot of people are saying, well, why do I have to go take all these prerequisites at the more expensive four-year institution? I can take them at, at a junior or community college, transfer over. And that's also becoming a very clear model. And so a lot of the youth today are making different types of strategic decisions about higher education that we need to pay attention to and honor, and to also to build, very clear pipeline programs from community colleges, four-year institutions, and even into graduate school.
Now this question is probably loaded, but what can the community do at this point to help? Because how do we re-engage our community? I think COVID-19 has done a number on our thinking, our psychic, how we see things, how we see each other. How do we re-engage our community and our education to bridge the gap? What is Dr. Lynn saying? 3 E's: employment, enrollment, or enlistment. Okay. All right. She's saying that you get them a job, you enroll them in school, or you enlist them into I guess the military or something. I guess that's a good thing to do to keep them engaged. I would agree with that. But how do we re-engage our community to get our community back involved with our kids? We had a young man, and I'm sure you saw this on the news. We had a young man that was sitting in the car with his daughter, 7-year-old daughter. He was shot. She was shot. Both murdered. How do we get our young people? And see, this is the thing. I had gone to a Chinese nail salon, to get my nails done. This was a few years back. And I asked the gentleman, I said, how is it that your youth go to college, stay out of jail, do not get in trouble. They're not, this is not their first language. This English is their second language. And somehow they come here, they go to school, they get a job, and become contributing citizens of the country, of society. Our kids they live here, they grow up here, and then they end up in jail. Okay, then they go to prison, or they end up murdered. Okay, how do we change? Because I think crime, murder of African American men and women is a public health crisis. Okay, I see it as a public health crisis. I don't just see it as, oh, someone else got murdered last night in North St. Louis. Oh, somebody else got murdered last night in North County. I see it as a public health crisis. What can we do to engage our community to get them to wake up that we're losing generations of young, talented people to the streets, to the gangs, to prison, to the graveyard? How do we get them re-engaged? What can we do?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question. It's a great question for us to continue to wrestle with and to ask. And there are a lot of different types of things that have to happen. And some of it, I won't say some of it, I'm sorry, all of it actually should be driven by communities. And so communities, we don't often really tap into them in very important and significant ways to hear their ideas about how do we fix what's going on. And it's not only about also fixing by identifying what's wrong. It's sometimes even more important to focus on, you've got this problem, but there are also some really important assets, some great strengths in your community that we can start to highlight, put more resources behind, so that those start to overshadow some of the things that are not working as well. So some of this is also about framing. How do we frame challenges? How do we frame issues? Do we frame them as impossible to ever address or to ever tackle, right? Or do we think about them from the perspective of what has to change radically in our communities, in our neighborhoods, in our cities, so that people understand that there are many more opportunities to lead sort of a healthier life, a more positive life than one that may take them down the path of crime. And so one of the projects that I work on, it's funded by the St. Louis County Public Health Department, called RECAST, which focuses on resilience and trauma. One of the entities that they funded a couple of years ago was Employment Connection. Mm-hmm. Employment Connection is in the city of St. Louis, and they frame their work as addressing violence, because they recognize that if people had jobs, they're less likely to engage in violent activity and violent behaviors. And so also we need to think about how can we reframe our solutions as well. When you ask someone, and I have this conversation with my students in public health, when we tell you that addressing poverty can solve many issues, that sounds really hard and really difficult. I don't know how to fix poverty. I don't have all the strategies or tools to fix poverty, but you can start to fix other systems or other mechanisms or other pathways to help address issues of poverty. That also means that we have to have very clear changes in policies and laws so that we can address issues related to poverty. So we can address issues related to violent crime in neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. The other thing that we also have to realize is that most crime is within a community or even within racial ethnic groups, et cetera. So we have to just understand that the nature of these types of activities occurs within communities, and the same thing is happening in white communities. Most crime is white on white crime, just like a lot of crime in black communities is black on black crime, right?
Right.
So we have to be okay and just acknowledge that and say, how do we address that within those neighborhoods and those communities? And some of it is about framing, and some of it is about tapping into the wisdom and knowledge of communities. And so That could mean that we need to, think about how do we restructure neighborhoods in ways that allows them to be safe and people don't feel that they have to take something or get something that someone else has to benefit themselves. And so that also speaks to larger societal, values and norms as well.
See, that's why I think that we have to look at what is happening across the country and in our communities. So if you take St. Louis, for example, and you look at all of the schools that are closing, the high schools, and you taking the high schools out of the community, you taking the high schools out of the community in Los Angeles, Indianapolis. So across the country, you see high school closure. Then you see the wealth gap broadening between this community and that community. Then you see more and more and more men going to prison. So you can project within 10 to 15 years that there is going to be another marginalized community. You can project within 10 to 15 years that poverty will grow another 10 or 15%. So we have to be able to try to use young men like yourself, institutions like yours, to try to get to the root of this, to get this to stop by trying to open schools, after school programs, and to get people reconnected with resources so that they can be successful in life.
I agree. Institutions like, St. Louis University, there's Washington University, there's UMSL, Webster, Lindenwood, if all of these institutions of higher ed plus all of these, multi-billion dollar corporations got together and actually said, you know what, we can fix large problems in this community because we're willing to work together. There's enough money in many communities to fix and address some of the needs. It's a failure of inaction. It's a failure of commitment to actually do it. Part of that is because as a society, we really do believe in meritocracy. We really do believe that people have to pull themselves up individually. When that actually doesn't happen. It doesn't happen in white communities, and it shouldn't. Black communities should not feel that it has to happen in their community as well. So we have to also then find the ways of connecting people to resources, connecting people to networks that allow them to explore their interests, that promote and support the things that they want to do, and providing opportunities and structures for those to nurture and blossom. And so when you think about, some of the interest of kids, sometimes we squash those interests, and that's wrong. We actually need to support them and think, because they may not be interested in forever, but it may actually help with their development.
Right.
That may actually spur, some kid that's interested in music today might be solving cancer 20, 30 years later. It was because we fed that interest that allows them to nourish and to blossom in a healthy way, that allows them to eventually become productive and meaningful, folks in our communities. And that also may help to address some of the societal ills that we experience as well. And so we really have to kind of think about how do we, again, tap into communities and support them in ways that allow for the healthiest development and creating healthy opportunities for everybody.
Okay, very good, very good. What is your advice to a young person that may read about you somewhere and they say, my family is poor, my neighborhood is poor, I don't have any money, no one has any money in my family, but I want to change the pathway that I'm on. What advice would you give a young man like that? How can you just give us some background on yourself? I mean, I read your bio in the beginning, but how did you do what you did as a young man? How did you achieve so much?
It's a great question. First, I attribute everything to God, for God being in my life and helping to guide me. I also attribute it to I knew I had big dreams and big goals. I was actually planning to be a physician. I was not intending to be a college professor in any way, shape, or form.
Mm-hmm.
What I
both are big. I mean,
that was something that sort of came after.
uh-huh.
But part of it was my family supported me in any and every way that they could. I didn't come from a wealthy family. I would say we were working class, middle class. I grew up, just outside of the city limits. So one could say I grew up in the suburbs, but I didn't feel that I lived in the suburbs. And, I lived in a Black neighborhood. Everybody's parents went to work. I went to public schools. Mm-hmm. So, it's not that my family put me in certain kinds of things that people would say, oh, well, that's really expensive, that kind of stuff. What I do think happened when I grew up that may or may not exist now, and it may just exist also differently across the country. I became aware of different types of programs to support my interest. So there were programs for kids interested in science and technology. I'd sign up for them. There were programs that promoted leadership development. I'd sign up for them. My mother hated it. Mm-hmm. Because that meant that she had to run me around to different things. My brother was playing basketball. She had, she ran him around. My dad, did what he could, getting people to this and that. My mother, we probably stressed my mom out. Well, she'd admit to it that, we ran her ragged, but she was committed to our dreams in a way that allowed both my brother and myself to blossom and to find our own path. Mm-hmm. As I listened to conversations and in interviews with young Black men around my age, younger than me, older than me, I can identify things in my life where if it wasn't for God, if it wasn't for having a strong family support, there could have been something that would have derailed me a different way. Even when I listened to my mom say that when I got in trouble in school, they wanted to kick me out, but because I was smart, they didn't kick me out. Or because my aunt knew somebody or my mom knew somebody that they were like, well, it's not going to help him getting kicked out. Let's do something else, create a different strategy to keep him busy and to make sure that, we don't kick him out. So those kinds of things have to happen, not just on an individual basis, but on a larger scale to make sure that we protect kids. And that's really important. And so, I have a colleague that unfortunately passed at St. Louis University that would say that his name was Dr. Norm White. And he would say, kids are not broken, adults are. So let's fix the adults. Let's fix the systems and structures and the dysfunctional systems and structures that adults have put into place so that kids can grow up healthy and happy and follow their dreams and passions. And so, that's kind of how I see myself when I see, okay, I made some different choices, but also I recognize that there's some things that have happened to me that could have derailed me in a particular way. But because of support in a number of different ways, I didn't go down that path.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And Dr. Lynn, she said that when she went to college, she did not see a lot of Black male professors. And I did not either. I went to undergrad, graduate school, law school. I can count on one hand the number of Black professors that I've seen. So I'm sure you can't do everything, but I'm sure you have kids that you mentor and that you assist.
Yeah, so I try to, not only, undergrads, but grad students. I work mostly with grad students at St. Louis University, but undergrads and any chance and opportunity I can talk to, kids in high school and middle school to let them know that there are opportunities. There are people that look like them, at colleges and universities teaching. There are people that look like them in the operating room, in the courtroom, those kinds of things. And so we don't often lend ourselves or make ourselves available to other people to see. And so it's always funny when I'm around, just different places within the city. And if I see someone sort of from my professional life, people will say, wait a minute, you're a college professor? Like, you don't look old enough to be a college professor. You don't look Like, you don't look like a college professor that I grew up with. And the same with me. I didn't have many black professors in college either. And so, we have to sort of make sure that we're visible to the community in ways that allow people to know that there are many different ways of sort of living and existing and following career paths. So I'll use myself again as an example. As I mentioned, I was planning to go to med school. I had a study abroad experience that started me to start, questioning other things about why people were unhealthy. And that led me down a path to studying public health. And that wasn't what I originally dreamed, but I recognized that public health was another space, another opportunity for me to have a much larger impact on the health and well-being of Black communities than just in the operating room. And there's nothing wrong with that choice either, but I chose a different way. And we also have to be okay with nourishing and helping kids to explore, their various interests, because they could end up doing something different. And so now, when I lecture, when I talk to community groups, I can talk to a lot more people in that way than I could have if I were, in a physician's role.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've done well. You've done a tremendous job, and I am so proud of you. And I would love to have you back. We are out of time. I would love for you to have the last word on how to work through systemic racism and structural systems that's, causing you not to progress in life. What's your last word on that?
So I guess I will end with saying, wherever you live, whatever your community is, whatever your communities of other identity and sort of your other networks, use those as a way of advancing not only your own individual health, but the health and well-being of your community. So that really, it calls for you getting involved, raising lots of questions, and being advocates for yourself and for your community and family. Excellent.
You've done a tremendous job. You are so awesome. You're an awesome young man. I give you a clap. Thank you so much for coming on. We're going to leave this feed, but I want to talk to you for just a few minutes. Thank you so much. I appreciate you. Thank you for those that tuned in. You were watching Legal Views with attorney Sheila R. Stuart, located in Clayton, Missouri, 231 Bemiston Avenue, Suite 800. My number here is 314-854-1339. And yes, we will have Dr. Gilbert back with us later in the year. Thank you so much and have a great evening.
Thank you.